Hello boys and girls, welcome to my channel, I'm for Classic and welcome to BenchART. So for today what I do have needed is WRC 9, a game developed by Kivatune, and it is using their in-house technology called KT Engine. Kivatune were the developers mainly of all the WRC games starting from the 5th one. Alright, so they did develop WRC 5, 6, 7, 8 and obviously now 9. They were also the developers behind Flatout 4 and not Bugbear, which is kind of interesting. But first let's take a look on the settings that I'm using to run WRC 9 with an Intel HD 620. So what you are looking in here, it is the low settings, and it is exactly the settings that I will be using throughout the video at 720p. But I had to make some tweaks because it wasn't really enough to have 30 frames per second. So I decided to go to, you need to go to your documents folder, search for my games folder, search for WRC9. You will find a file called user config. Right, this is not a new tweak, I already used it in other Kivatune games before. And if you search for something that says, for example, dynamic resolution, if you look at the minimum resolution, it is set automatically to 0.9. If you reduce to 0.5, you will get an extra performance. So what this exactly does, it is by default the game, it is allowed to drop 10% of its internal resolution to sustain a performance of 30 frames per second. So what I'm doing in here, it is to allow the game to drop 50% of the resolution if needed to get 30 frames per second. It doesn't mean that the game will be dropping to 50% of resolution scaling. It means that it will be scaling down the resolution until it gets to 30 frames per second. Alright, and the limit is 50% of resolution scaling. So looking to the minimum requirements, there is no specification in here for any Intel HD graphic card. So looking into these requirements, clearly we aren't really supported in here by any means. So any buyer would be scratching their head thinking that should this run or not. But the reality it can run. So with the low settings, with dynamic resolution scaling tweak that I've made, my performance throughout two different stages, it was an average of 32 frames per second with a 1% low of 30. I also tested the game without tweaks, it was with low settings, and despite the average was 30 frames per second, there was moments where the game did drop below 30 frames per second to something like 25. Also, with minimum settings, which includes disabling shadows and particles, which is the absolutely minimum you can go for this game, and it feels wrong, honestly, to play without shadows and particles on a rally game, even though it wasn't really enough to provide a sustainable 30 frames per second. So for me, the low settings, you can still keep the shadows and particles, but the only difference is the game will be dropping down the resolution scaling every time it needs to go below 30 frames per second. For me, that is the correct way of playing WRC 9. So consoles does run this game at 30 frames per second, and despite we are able to run the game at 30 frames per second too, this is a very fast racing game at some points, and I don't agree that 30 frames per second provides the experience that we need. I think that the best experience for this game, and it makes a huge difference in gameplay, it would be 60 frames per second. Playing from 60 frames per second and going to a PC playing at 30 frames per second almost feels like a different game with different handling. I'm not really sure why this is happening, but 30 frames per second on WRC 9, it doesn't feel enough. I'm not really sure how guys on consoles can play at 30, but for me it feels a little bit weird. So as you can see, the MSI Afterburner, it is reporting a locked 30 frames per second. This is because I locked down the frame rate to 30 frames per second because of temperatures of the Intel HD 620. So by locking the frame rate to 30 FPS, it means that I will be saving a little bit of power and preventing the Intel HD graphic card to overheat even more than it is doing already. Alright. But either way, the results that I did show you off before, all those results were gathered without recording. So the question is, can you run WRC 9 with an Intel HD 620? Yes, you can. You can play on minimum if you want, despite you will have drops with 30s. But for me, the best way, again, it is to play with low preset. Just put everything on low. Go to the config file of the game and adjust the minimum resolution scaling to 0.5. Do that, and if you want, lock the game at 30 frames per second and enjoy the experience. All right. As for the frame rate, and again, console players do play this game at 30 frames per second, so why shouldn't you be able to do it too? That's the main question. So, but what about the game? What is new in WRC 9 comparing to WRC 8? WRC 9 doesn't change that much from WRC 8, and honestly, I'm not really a fan of this gameplay. I'm probably more in line with the Codemasters work. Alright, I do love Dirt Rally, but still, I'm not saying that WRC 8 or 9 it is bad. It is a good game, but gameplay wise, if you are kind of adept, or I don't know, if you always play Dirt or Dirt Rally, which are very different games though. Dirt Rally, it is a full simulation game. If you always play Dirt Rally and you are going to jump to WRC, you are going to notice a big difference in, well, physics. Alright, that's mostly the biggest thing. The biggest difference, it is really the physics, and I can't really enjoy WRC because on my mind I keep comparing it to Dirt Rally. That's the issue, because Dirt Rally in my mind it is simply perfect, and WRC in my mind it is simply not. I don't really enjoy the physics engine, but honestly WRC 9 done a great job revamping even further the physics comparing to WRC 8, so they are always going on a better routes than they had before. So if we compare WRC 9 to all the predecessor games, we see that Kilotoon have been always improving over time. Each year there is a new WRC game coming out, and they are always improving over the predecessor game. So who knows, sometimes they will catch up to Dirt Rally. We don't really know about that, but still they are doing a great job improving. There are tons of stages in this game, which is a very good extra. We have tons of tracks, tons of different environments, and it even have my country, which is Portugal. So amazing. A lot of tracks there though. Alright, so guys, I think that's all that I want to talk about WRC 9. Basically, if you played WRC 8, WRC 9 doesn't really change that much as expected, since it's only a 1 year difference, and they didn't really revamp it that much, which is something that on WRC 8 they really revamped the game a lot with tons of new stuff. But WRC 9, it is just small improvements and fixes comparing to WRC 8. Alright, so guys, I think that's all again that I want to talk about WRC 9. Hope you keep enjoying the rest of the video, and I do hope to see you soon. Goodbye.
Hard brake for hairpin left. Over tarmac and flat left over 80. And flat right long into finish. Left 4 over crest opens, into flat left jump, and left 4 over crest long, into right 5 short over crest and flat left, for crest into right 5 long, tightens 4, short 30, left 4, and right 4 keep in, very long over crest 30, left 5, keep into right 4, tightens over crest. Into left 5, short, 30. Right 4, keep into big jump over crest, 100. Caution, left 4, hard brake, tightens 2, don't cut, 100. Left 5, keep into crest, jump, 30. Right 4 tightens over crest and left 5 keep in, tightens over crest 80. right 4 very long, tightens into jump over crest. And left 4 opens, 50. Flat right over crest, jump, 50. Jump, maybe 30. And right 5 tightens short in crest, 30. Into right 5 over crest, big jump, opens. And flat left tightens 5, 50. And left 4 over bumps, into crest, jump. Left 4 short, keep in and flat right and caution, 40. Right 3 over crest, 30. Caution, right 4 short, bumpy over crest, 200. Left 4 short over crest, 50. Over crest right 5, keep into flat left long, tighten 3, don't cut. For crest into right 6, keep into left 5 short. And right 3 opens long. And right 5 short. And jump over crest 60. Caution, right 3 tightens 80. Keep left over crest into right 4 short. And left 6 short 30. Crest, keep middle over jump into flat left 50. Right 6 bumpy over crest into left 3 medium, opens 30. Caution, hard brake for left 2, don't cut. Into flat right over crest 30. Left 5 over crest 70. Left 4 short 100. Jump over crest into flat right, tightens 5, keep in 30. Right 3 tightens, keep in over crest 30. And crest into left 5, keep in 30. Right 4, keep in 30. Right 4 long. Into flat left, short 300 over bumps for finish.